mentioned the Palmer ratio. The middle 50% doesn't change.
Yeah.
So is that more a facet of statistics, the middle part of the statistical range not moving, or is it something more structural?
Well, Palmer's interpretation is that it's got to do with basically what he calls political settlement. Yeah? If the middle 50% side with the elite can implement a lot of things to kind of suck the resources out of the bottom 40%. If the middle 50% side with the bottom 40%, the ability of the elite is limited. Yeah? So it is very much dependent on the political alliances between different groups. So it's, in that sense, that more of a structural thing.
I might make a few assumptions here that may be questionable, but if you were to, say, take a more class-based analysis to it, you could essentially say the top 10% would be the capitalists, the middle 50% that doesn't move could be, for example, the middle-class consumerists, and the bottom 40% could be the working class. So would it be that to maintain this capital accumulation at the top, you require a sort of almost static middle 50% to continue to, for example, consume the goods to provide capital for accumulation at the top?
Yes. Well, first of all, I'm not sure whether these days top 10% is capitalist class. Yeah? I mean, it was the case in the 19th century, but not anymore because there's a huge concentration at the top. So the top 10% is more like the professional class, yeah? Rather than the capitalist class. Yeah? So these are people like, I don't know, lawyers, people working in, I mean, maybe not at the top, but at the sort of middle level of the financial industry, and people working in IT business and so on. So actually, if you look at this data in detail, you get to see a lot of very interesting differences across countries. So, for example, if you take South Korea, the top 1% there compared to other countries doesn't do that well, but the top 10% does very well. I mean, it's probably only second to the United States. Yeah? So you have very different kind of class dynamics going on there. Now, having said that, yes, I mean, obviously, if the income gets concentrated too much at the top, even the middle class might have difficulty consuming enough to provide enough demand for businesses to be run profitably. So I think this has been, I mean, we actually have something that relates to this that discussed in other lectures, but there's been increasing concern with that because now, for example, after the financial crisis of 2008, it basically came out that the American middle class has been keeping up its consumption level only because it could borrow huge amount of money. I mean, I have some statistics to show you in another lecture. So because the median wage in the United States has been basically stagnant for the last 40 years. So the only way that they could keep up the consumption was by borrowing. And now, of course, this is becoming a problem because a lot of people are overloaded with that. Many of them, even if they could borrow, got burned during the financial crisis and are not borrowing as much. So yes, I mean, there's a genuine concern about the so-called disappearance of the middle class. And yes, I mean, who knows? I mean, in a few decades, Palmer ratio might have to be revised, because it's based on empirical regularity. So there's nothing sacred about 10 and 40. So let's see how the world evolves.
Will you discuss more in depth how wealth is contributing to inequality? Well, because I have a problem with your income focus, because there's also income from having a portfolio that you get money out of bonds and other asset classes.
That's right, yeah. Yeah, so the basic picture is that most people do not own much asset. Yeah? So asset is very much concentrated at the top. And yeah, of course, it generates the income. So potentially high inequality in asset distribution means high inequality in income. However, as I showed, this translation is not direct, yeah? Because the people might use wealth in different ways. Yeah? So that they might, in some countries, they might use it to make financial investment. In other countries, it might be put into the more industrial ventures. Yeah? In others, it may be put into agricultural projects. So that's going to make differences to the returns. And then there are differences in the way wealth is inherited and taxed. Yeah? So in some countries, inheritance tax is high. Yeah? In others, it's low. Some countries have abolished it. Yeah? And I think they abolished that. But in Germany, for a while, they had this interesting inheritance law, which said that if you are bequeathing a company to your descendant, as far as that descendant keeps the company in business for a certain period, like 10 years, and doesn't cut employment, after that he or she does that, he or she will be exempt from inheritance tax. Yeah? So that's an interesting way of using inheritance tax to encourage investment in the real economy and increase employment. Also, in some countries, capital gains is very lightly taxed, like in the United States. So much so that Warren Buffett, the famous financier, once complained that the effective rate of tax that he pays is lower than that of his cleaner. Yeah? His cleaner pays income tax. Yeah? He pays capital gains tax, which is lower than income tax. So, in that kind of country, putting your wealth into financial investment will bring a lot more gains than in other countries where capital gains actually can be taxed quite highly. So there are a lot of intermediate variables that you need to look at, which is why, despite having much higher inequality in terms of wealth distribution than Thailand, say, Norway has much lower income distribution. This linkage between wealth and income distributions is not very well explored in economics, so maybe that's the next frontier. Yes?
Yeah. First, thank you very much for your lecture. In the last part, you argue that countries have some political space in order to fight against inequalities. However, is the solution the same for all countries, and especially for developing one, particularly when we know that they face some difficulties in mobilizing revenue, in increasing taxes? So.
Well, I think, one theme that constantly runs through our series of lectures is that there's a huge diversity in policies and institutional arrangements across different countries. Yeah? And even among countries with similar conditions, like the OECD countries, there's a huge diversity in terms of the financial system, corporate governance. We are going to talk about this in my other lectures. So yeah, that, if you like, diversity of capitalism is one running theme in this series. But yes, that also you need to consider the level of development and each country's history. Yeah? So inequality has risen hugely in China in the last few decades, but at least at this stage of development seems to have encouraged investment and economic growth. Yeah? So maybe you could say that it has been a good thing, although the level of inequality in China is very, very serious, and it might become a political powder keg. Yeah? So I'm not saying that everything is fine, but at least in that country, rising inequality seems to have facilitated investment and economic growth. But as you develop further, I think that it's very difficult to make that argument. I mean, in the rich countries, increase in inequality, I don't think anywhere has resulted in accelerated economic growth, because at the higher level of economic development, things like the education and worker skills and technology and research, these things matter more rather than sheer investment in kind of machines, yeah? Sheer amount of time that workers are made to put in the producing things. So at the lower level of development, you can see how concentration of wealth in a small capitalist class might actually facilitate development. But at the higher level of income, I think it's highly unlikely that this is the case, because you need different things to develop your economy at that stage of development. So yes, I mean, very much, I mean, that you will have to find your own solution. And we've already seen that even within the OECD countries, there are countries like Korea and Switzerland that try to control inequality by regulating market rather than redistributing. There are countries like Austria and Finland, which basically let the market rip and try to fix it with redistribution. There's no ideal solution. You will have to find a solution that is good for you. Although I think in the end, citizenship-based universal welfare state is the most fair thing, because if you have a system like the Korean or the Swiss one, if you are recognized as weak people and are protected by the government, that's fine. But there are people who just fall through the cracks, yeah? Because it's all done by sort of economic categories rather than citizenship. Yeah? So small shops, small farms, small firms. Yeah? I mean, the disadvantaged regions. But what if you are still poor but do not belong to any of these categories? Yeah? So I think in the long run, that is the fairest solution. But having said that, I mean, you need to recognize that countries have different histories, they are at different stages of development, they have different political settlements, they have different kind of ethical and political attitude towards inequality. You know, I mean, France is a country in which inequality seems to have fallen in the last few decades, but as you see in Ha-Joon, the people are still unhappy with it. Yeah? No, I mean, there's nothing wrong with it. You know, different countries have different levels of tolerance for inequality. Yeah? I mean, the level of inequality that you see in the US will be totally unacceptable in many European countries. Yeah? Not all, but many Americans accept it. Yeah? Although even there, I mean, there's a lot of political discontent and rise of the left and so on. But yes, I mean, that you have to accept that countries have to find their own solutions according to their own history, politics, cultural values, and so on.
So I think you explicitly mentioned you're in favor of a welfare state type system, or did I misunderstand you? I just wonder if you had any thoughts on, for example, a universal basic income. I understand there are various different types of them.
Well, when I say welfare state, I mean, I specifically mean universal welfare state. I mean, there are very targeted welfare state system like in the United States. I mean, almost everything is only for the poorer people, whereas in Europe, especially in Scandinavia, almost everything is based on your citizenship. So even if you're rich, you get child benefit, you get support for childcare and so on. So I'm talking about a universal welfare state. Now, compared to that, this idea of universal basic income that has become very popular recently, as you implied in your question, first of all, it really depends on what you mean by it. So, for example, people like Milton Friedman and Friedrich von Hayek, even though they didn't use that word, were actually in favor of some form of universal basic income. But their idea is basically to abolish the welfare state altogether, give everyone a cash sum, which presumably is enough for them to survive, and then just let them be. I'm totally against that system of provision, because then we'll have very different types of the provisions of essential services. So rich people will get better education, poorer people will go to crappy schools. So I'm not in favor of that form of universal basic income at all. Now, the more left-leaning people have argued that the welfare state as it stands has become too complicated. There's no fungibility of funds across different things, and why don't we, if you like, increase the discretionary element by making more of it cash-based rather than saying, oh, you have to be unemployed under these circumstances to get unemployment benefit. You have to be disabled to get this. That, I think, is a kind of interesting proposition. But you have to realize that already we have in countries with substantial welfare state, I mean, including the US, that you have already some kind of universal basic entitlement. Yeah? It's only that they are very specifically tied to certain circumstances rather than given in cash. So you cannot, in Britain, call up the NHS and say, look, I've never used the National Health Service for the last 25 years. I'm a very fit guy. And there must have been some cash equivalent that I can claim from you because I haven't used your service. I want to go for my holiday of life in a safari in South Africa. Can you give me that cash? No, you're not allowed to get that. Yeah? So if you turn it into universal basic income rather than universal basic entitlement, you can use the money as that you want. But even there, I think there's a problem because unless this sum is really generous, people who are poorer are going to use this basic cash entitlement for immediate needs. Yeah? So ignore more long-term things like education and healthcare and other learning and so on, and meet more immediate needs with this cash. So I think it is quite important to have a system of provision which guarantees that even poor people who necessarily have to be more short-term oriented have basic entitlement to long-term things like education and health and so on. So yes, I mean, a lot depends on the design, but I think that even if you have a kind of well-designed system, if it comes with any suggestion that you whittle down entitlement to essential services, then I have a problem with that.
So you mentioned at the beginning of that also, sort of, and you said it a couple of times, basis of citizenship. So an entitlement to these things based on citizenship. So when you look at somewhere like, for example, London, where we are at the moment, which is heavily reliant on very underpaid migrant labour, who are often undocumented or various forms of citizenship, residency, etc., you end up with potential exclusion from these aspects. So do you have anything to say upon that?
Yeah, no, I'm an immigrant myself, and I don't have British citizenship, so I pay all the taxes. I can claim, I mean, the welfare benefits, but I cannot vote. So when I said citizenship, I didn't mean to imply that only full citizens should get this. I mean, there are different types of belonging. So the ultimate form is full citizenship, but even there, I mean, the countries have different arrangements. Some countries allow multiple nationalities. My native country, South Korea, doesn't. So if I want to get a UK passport, I have to give up my South Korean one. So, I mean, even there, there are different arrangements. But yes, I mean, there's citizenship, full residency, work permit, down to illegal immigrants. So when you actually design the policy, you will have to actually have graded, kind of approach to this. And yeah, of course, that some countries are meaner to immigrants than others, but it has to be basically based on this notion of contribution and if you like, collective insurance. Yeah? So insofar as you have contributed to the national economy and society, you should be entitled to some claim towards collective insurance, giving you health insurance, education insurance, and so on. So yeah, I didn't mean to say that it has to be only full citizens and not other people. But you know, in that context, I really want to emphasize that the welfare state, if it's universal, is more of a collective insurance rather than hand out to the less fortunate people. And you know, for example, I saw this report that in Denmark, which has literally one of the highest taxes in the world, something like 88% of the population is happy with the level of tax they are paying because they think they are getting the worth of the money. In the US, the support for the welfare state tends to be lower because it's very selective. So a lot of middle class people feel that we are only paying the money, we are not getting any benefit. Whereas in Denmark, everyone gets something back. Of course, in proportional terms, if you are richer, you get less than when you are poor, but still you get free education, free health, the free childcare. I mean, I shouldn't say free. That's wrong because it's free at the point of access. It's not free because we have paid taxes. Even actually poor people pay taxes because they say that they pay value-added tax in Europe. They say that paid general sales tax in America. So that this idea that the welfare state is somehow poorer people scrounging on richer people by getting free service, that is completely wrong. But yes, I mean, they are free at the point of access. And I mean, that system of collective insurance is actually much more effective because, for example, in the US, the country spends something like 17 to 18% of GDP on healthcare. In contrast, other comparable countries in Europe, they spend between 9 and 12%. But the US has the worst health indicator of all the rich countries because this provision the system is inefficient because it's fragmented. There's a lot of middlemen, the insurance company and the lawyers and so on taking a cut. So that you actually end up spending far more by having this private health system than having this collective insurance system. So yes, I mean that I think that we have to change the discourse on the welfare state. It's not hand out to poorer people. Even poor people pay taxes. Let's not forget that. And on top of that, make it universal and it becomes collective insurance system rather than this fragmented system like the American health insurance system, which that becomes very costly.